Sometimes you just set yourself up for failure. And this painting? Oh, I made sure of it. I used the wrong medium, the wrong techniques, and turned what should have been a simple painting into a long, unnecessary struggle. But somehow, despite all of that, it still turned out great. So today I'm taking you through 6 mistakes you do not want to make, so you can save yourself time, frustration, and unnecessary suffering. Let's get into it. Mistake number 1: choosing the wrong medium. The first and possibly biggest mistake I made was choosing the wrong medium for this painting. I went with watercolors, and while that might sound like a perfectly fine choice at first, let me explain why it was absolutely not the right call for this piece. When selecting a medium, you have to think about the kind of effects you want to achieve in your final painting. And in my case, I already had a clear vision. I always create my references beforehand, so I knew this painting would have a lot of atmospheric depth, soft gradients, and glowing light effects. That means I needed something that could handle smooth transitions, deep contrasts, and multiple layers without becoming muddy or uncontrollable. Watercolor, unfortunately, is not built for that. It's fantastic for loose, transparent washes and spontaneous effects, but when you need soft blendings, strong highlights, and deep shadows, it can become a nightmare. And the biggest issue? No real control over layering. Unlike acrylics or oils, where you can layer and blend indefinitely, watercolors dry fast and stain the paper, which makes corrections nearly impossible. If you overwork an area, it starts looking patchy or dull. And let's talk about light and contrast. This painting has a bright glowing moon as a light source and a seascape that needed to feel vast and three-dimensional. Watercolors, because of their transparency, struggle with strong, saturated shadows. You can't just pile on dark tones the way you can with oils or acrylics. They tend to look weak and uneven, unless you plan every layer perfectly in advance. And let's be honest, I definitely did not plan that well here. So, lesson learned. If your painting relies on seamless gradients, deep contrast, and glowing effects, watercolor is probably not your best friend. Next time, I will stick to acrylics or oils for a piece like this. Because, believe me when I tell you, fighting your own medium for hours is not a fun experience I like to repeat. Now, let's talk about how I actually started this painting. I began by applying masking fluid to the moon, butterflies, flowers, and the tail. Then I filled in the background with a warm, flowing watercolor wash. And honestly, this part looked beautiful. You can see these soft, delicate effects, exactly what watercolors are known and meant for. They create this effortless lightness, this dreamy atmosphere that's hard to replicate with any other medium. But here's the problem. As soon as I started layering in the water effects, all of that delicate beauty started to disappear. And that's a real tragedy of using watercolor for this kind of painting. Its most distinct and unique qualities, the soft transitions, the airy transparency, get lost when you try to force it into doing something it wasn't meant to do. Now, that doesn't mean the final painting isn't beautiful. I actually love how it turned out in the end. But that's only because, over time, I've learned how to correct my mistakes. I've developed ways to fix things when they go wrong. And more importantly, I've learned to avoid making these mistakes in the first place. This painting is a perfect example of that journey. From complete frustration, feeling like I ruined everything, to eventually pulling it all together. Looking at the finished piece, you'd never guess how much I struggled. It looks like it was meant to be this way. And that honestly is what makes this process so interesting. Seeing just how many things you can do wrong and still end up with something that works. And this is what I love so much about painting. You can struggle through every step, make all the wrong choices, but somehow still create something magical. And speaking of magic, I'm beyond excited to announce my new limited print collection. Every single print is hand-signed and numbered, and for the first time you can get a stunning extra large canvas edition of my newest painting fresh from the studio, the Norse goddess of love and magic, Freya. This collection features some of my most beloved pieces from the past year, mythological goddesses like Isis, the ancient Egyptian moon goddess, Freya and Inari, a dreamy Studio Ghibli-inspired artwork, and even the legendary Lady Guinevere. And due to popular demand, I'm bringing back the limited edition print of my painting Perfect Blue. And of course, Oinoe, the painting from this very video, The Beautiful Mermaid, is also available as a limited edition print. Each print is crafted with museum quality materials to capture every detail and color of the original artwork, making them a truly special addition to any collection. But these are limited editions, so once they're gone forever. I absolutely love making my art available to as many people as possible. This just makes me so happy. And this is your chance to own a piece of it. Check out the collection now. I will leave a link in the description below. Alright, now let's get back to the next mistakes I did. Mistake number 2, making the face too small. So after setting myself up for disaster with the wrong medium, you'd think I'd at least make smart decisions with the actual painting process. But nope. Next mistake, I made the face way too small. Now, at first glance, this might not seem like a big deal. The technique itself was fine. I used my usual method for skin tones, mixing a balanced base color and blending in warm hues like orange, ochre and brown while everything was still wet. That part worked exactly as it should. But the problem? The face is barely twice the size of my thumb. That's tiny. And here is why that's an issue. Details. When you paint a face that small, every little feature, eyes, lips, nose, becomes ridiculously difficult to define. I quickly realized that my watercolor base just wasn't giving me the precision I needed, so I tried to fix it with colored pencils, and that's when the struggle began. To get the definition I wanted, I had to layer an absurd amount of colored pencils over the dried watercolor, way more than I normally would. And even after all of that effort, it still wasn't enough, so I had to bring in the emergency backup, gouache. Gouache is a great tool because it's opaque, meaning I could finally add those crisp, sharp edges that just weren't happening with colored pencils alone. Things like eyebrows, eyelashes, and delicate facial highlights were all done with gouache. Simply because I had no other choice. If I had painted the face larger from the beginning, I wouldn't have needed to go through all these extra steps just to make it work. So, moral of the story, if you want fine details, give yourself enough space to actually paint them. Otherwise, you will end up stacking so many correction layers that your painting turns into a mixed media Frankenstein. And honestly, after all that unnecessary layering, I started questioning my life choices. But if you actually want to improve your watercolor skills without making 100 mistakes along the way, there's a great way to do it. And that is with the help of today's video sponsor Skillshare, the ultimate online learning platform for creatives. Whether you're into illustration, painting, design, or even filmmaking, Skillshare has thousands of classes to help you develop your skills, taught by experienced professionals who really know their craft. And since we are talking about watercolor struggles, today I want to highlight a class that would have saved me a lot of time and frustration: Expressive Portraits in Watercolor, Capturing Emotion and Character by Will Elliston. This class is an absolute must-watch if you want to improve your watercolor techniques, especially when it comes to creating depth, blending colors, and capturing expressive faces. Will breaks everything down into clear, actionable steps. So instead of spending hours fixing mistakes like I did, you can actually focus on making your paintings better from the start. One of the things I love about Skillshare is that it's designed for artists like us. The platform is all about learning by doing, meaning every class comes with a hands-on project, so you can immediately apply what you've learned. Plus, the community aspect is amazing. You can share your work, get feedback, and connect with like-minded creatives who are just as passionate about art as you are. And here's the best part. The first 500 people to use my link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So if you want to level up your watercolor skills or explore something completely new, click the link below and start learning today. Who knows? Your next masterpiece might be just one Skillshare class away. Alright, back to the chaos, because the struggles were far from over. Mistake number 3. Overcomplicating elements. After battling with the face, I finally caught a little break. Painting the hair went surprisingly smooth. No unnecessary disasters, no major regrets. But of course, that didn't last long, because then I moved on to the mermaid tail. Oh my gosh. And here's where I once again made things way harder than they needed to be. My brilliant idea? Using masking fluid to preserve individual scales. In theory, this sounds like a great way to create crisp, detailed highlights. In reality, it just left me with a bunch of random white dots that did not look good at all. So instead of this quick, effortless technique that I imagined, I ended up having to fix everything manually. I had to go over the entire tail, layering and layering, to correct the weird highlights, redefine the scales, and darken the whole thing. Basically, I created an entire extra step that served no purpose whatsoever, because in the end, you don't even see those original white spots. So what's the lesson here? Not every time-saving technique actually saves time. Sometimes just painting things normally from the start is way more efficient. And honestly, after this whole process, I might need to rethink my entire relationship with masking fluid. Mistake number 4, struggling with glow effects. After my questionable choices with the mermaid tail, I moved on to painting the moon. And compared to everything else, this part actually went surprisingly well. The inside of the moon turned out great. Watercolor was actually a good choice here. I started with a wet-on-wet technique, letting the pigment flow naturally to create that beautiful organic crater texture. Then I added some final details with gouache, layering subtle highlights and refining the surface. So far, so good. But then came the glow around the moon, and that's where things got tricky. To get that soft radiant effect, I had to use gouache, which, to be fair, did the job. It looks luminous, and from a distance it gives the illusion of a gentle glow. But here's the thing. If I had used oil paint, the glow would have been so much smoother, so much softer, without me having to fight with layers. Oils are perfect for atmospheric effects like this, because they blend seamlessly, whereas gouache, no matter how carefully you apply it, always dries just a little too harsh in comparison. And this is something I think a lot of artists underestimate. Not every painting is suited for just one medium, or for every medium. Some elements work better in one technique, while others benefit from a completely different approach. That's why I often work in mixed media, using for example acrylic for certain areas, because oil would take too long to dry, while keeping oils for sections where I need that buttery smooth blending. But mixing oil and watercolor, that's a whole different level of difficulty. And as you will see later, that actually becomes a bit of a problem in this painting. So the real takeaway here is, before you start a painting, think about what's most important. What's the key element that needs to look perfect? Should it have glowing light effects, strong contrast, super fine details? Once you identify that, you can pick your medium accordingly. Or, if needed, find the right combination of materials to get the best possible result. And in this case, watercolor for the moon surface worked great. Gouache for the glow, not terrible, but oil would have been the smarter choice. Mistake number 5, turning the background into a muddy mess. So after the moon, I moved on to painting the background. And this is where things really started getting complicated. The lower part of the painting is meant to be very dark. There's the shadow edge of the pond or shoreline with rocks and a deep, mysterious water surface. Behind that, you have water lilies floating on top. Now, the challenge, keeping all of that from turning into one big muddy mess. To achieve the darkness I needed, I had to layer multiple washes of watercolor, which technically is fine, but the more layers I added, the harder it became to keep the shapes and contrasts readable. Instead of a nice deep background with clear depth, I was constantly on the verge of everything blending into a vague, undefined mass. What worked surprisingly well though were the reeds and water plants. These actually turned out quite nice and added some much needed structure to the scene. And then I moved on to the mermaid's tail fin, carefully painting the delicate strokes of the fins. This part wasn't too bad, but again, oil would have been way easier for creating those smooth, flowing transitions. With watercolor, it took much more precision to avoid harsh edges. After the struggle with the background, I went back and refined the hair. And honestly, this might be my favorite part of the whole painting. Using colored pencils, I carefully added fine strands and highlights, giving the turquoise hair a beautiful sense of movement. I even removed some gouache in places and layered more details on top to really enhance the texture. And then I added one of my favorite little touches, glowing stars and pearls. With tiny outlines of gouache, I gave them a soft, luminous effect, which really helped bring the piece together. This part actually worked perfectly, and I love how it turned out. But just when I thought I was finished, I took a step back and realized something was still missing. The painting looked too flat. And that's when I made a last-minute decision that completely changed everything. But you will see what I mean in a second. Mistake number 6, the radical fix, turning this into a true mixed media piece. So after all that work, I took a step back, looked at my painting and thought, damn, it's just too flat. It was lacking the depth, the atmosphere, all the magic I had envisioned. And that's when I made a very radical decision. You won't see this part on camera, but I went all in. First, I sprayed multiple layers of watercolor fixative over the entire painting, about 3 or 4 coats, essentially sealing everything in. Then I added a layer of transparent acrylic medium and let it fully dry. Why? Because at this point, I was about to do something insane. And that was pouring acrylic paint over the whole thing, so that it could run down in organic dripping effects. Immediately, it gave it a more dynamic and fluid feel, just not as stiff and flat like it looked before. And once that was dry, I brought out the big guns: oil paint. Now, like I mentioned earlier, mixing oil and watercolor is not easy. Normally, these two don't play well together. But since I had sealed the painting with acrylic, I could now layer transparent oil glazes over it without worrying about ruining the watercolors. And this is where the magic finally happened. I used thin layers of pink and other soft tones to enhance the background and add richness behind the mermaid's tail. I intensified the light effects, pushed the depth even further, and refined the colors around the face, making everything feel more alive and cohesive. At this point, I had basically come full circle. I finally did what I should have done from the very beginning: used oil paint for the depth and atmosphere. But here's the thing. While oil gave me those buttery soft gradients, the earlier watercolor layers and colored pencils were still crucial for the fine details. The delicate elements like the butterflies, the shells, the intricate strands of hair, these would have been a nightmare to paint in oils at this scale. So, in a weird way, my struggle actually led to something really special. In the end, this painting ended up using every single medium I own: watercolor, colored pencils, gouache, acrylic, and finally oil paint. It's honestly insane how much went into this piece. And despite all the frustration, all the unnecessary struggles, it's now one of my favorite paintings because I just refuse to give up on it. When a painting isn't working, I don't just walk away. I keep pushing until I get it right. And I'm so happy with the result. This piece truly embodies the spirit of Eunoe, a name found in Greek mythology, often associated with nymphs and the flow of water. Her name means good mind or well-minded, which feels fitting given the journey of this painting, starting as a struggle and transforming into something beautiful. And if you like it too, you can get a limited edition print on my website. And if you want to see the full chaotic process, the hours and hours I spent working on it, you can find the unedited painting process on my Patreon page. I have actually over 200 in-depth tutorials on Patreon. covering all kinds of techniques, mediums, and painting secrets. So if you enjoyed this video and want to dive deeper into my process, check it out. Link is in the video description. I hope you had fun watching this chaotic journey. Let me know in the comments, what's the worst art decision you've ever made? I'd love to hear your disaster stories. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe for more painting, chaos, and questionable decisions.